I can't wear cowboy boots. I don't think anybody with a shaved head can pull off cowboy boots. If you're doing that and you have a shaved head, don't do it. You just look like an extra from I don't know, an 80s porn movie maybe or something.
Welcome. It's a real pleasure to talk to you. And I would like to start with you with the Primordial coming to such a unique event as Into the Abyss. It isn't something like very popular formula of the festival, and I would like to ask you, how do you feel among all those different bands, and what do you reckon is going to be like the aftermath of the festival?
Well, it's definitely more interesting, I suppose. You know, you've got Salsifer and Godflesh, and then I can see Sabbath Assembly and Revenge and stuff on the same bill, Crypts kind of stuff. So it's very obviously a festival compiled by someone who has some musical taste. There's not much horrific mainstream terrible heavy metal, so it's kind of it feels more like a curated festival. Primordial's never played that much in Poland. You know, this is maybe 5th, 6th time, so that's more interesting to me, really. But yeah, it's a curious lineup, interesting, you know.
Yeah, so all those things combined. Okay, so my next question is actually based on the other interviews I've been watching, because you many times you mentioned that you are not the music isn't ruling over your life, like the way you write music, the way you work with music isn't like, let me phrase this correctly, isn't stopping you from doing your normal life. This is something like a side thing. So I want to ask you, how do you actually get on with making music? Well, how does it look like when you make music, and how do you make it so it doesn't like hinder your normal life?
That's a complicated question. I mean, the ideal situation would be able to play music and make a living from it, and be able to actually have a normal life, but then be devoted to making music. But in 2019, the amount of bands who are able to do that are very, very slim indeed, and they certainly aren't 5-piece rock bands, maybe for single electronic artists who are streaming millions of times, who make music on their, GarageBand Mac or whatever. It might be possible to make a terrible living, but the ideal situation would actually to be the complete opposite, but that's not the way it is. People have different responsibilities, different lives. They have their own day-to-day that they have to do, so the band has to work around that, and so on those terms you have to consider that when Primordial makes an album, comparing, and a lot of bands these days, comparing it to when bands were able to just fully devote themselves to music, you're judging things on the same standards as guys who are all working 9 to 5 and doing other things. But it's just the way things are now, so it's difficult, but at the same time, everyone has other things to be getting on with as well. So it's a balancing act. But I mean, that's the same of everything in life, really, isn't it? So.
Sticking to making music, what I've been discovering by listening to a band for many years is that no matter what the record is, which of course every single record is very unique in its own way, you're keeping the same image you said mostly at the beginning, like you're building still more primordial-ish, if I could phrase that.
Just trying to disrupt your rhythm. No, it's okay. Go on.
So I wanted to ask you whether you have been tempted by, at some point to just drastically change direction, or...
You mean like make an electronic album?
Not really like electronic, but speaking like something which elevated it, for example, with their acoustic album, which actually leads to my next question. You're being very consistent with your music, and this is something which comes as a merit or demerit
Well,
depends on how you look at it.
Well, I think consistency. I mean, if it's consistently very good or excellent, or I mean, I like to think we have a very high. It's Primordial has been going a long time. But it's about quality, really, not quantity. It's a cliche, but as I explained in the last answer, we don't really have the time to do quantity over quality anyway. So it has to work when it needs to work. I don't know. To be honest, the thing about it is that we never sat down and made a plan. We didn't plan, okay, this album's going to be this, and then in 12 months it's going to be this. Everything is very Irish, very, we just about skid in by the seat of our pants. Bad analogy, but it's sometimes a bit haphazard and a bit chaotic and a bit off the cuff. Like there's no grand plan, no grand design. Kieran doesn't sit and plan everything out, and we don't discuss a 3-year plan. It just sort of organically happens when it happens, and that's always a bit more chaotic than maybe it happens for some bands. I don't know. Like we don't trade files, we don't write remotely, we don't write on GarageBand, and like Kieran doesn't send a whole song complete with a drum machine. Like we still get in a room, argue and shout and piss each other off and make loads and loads of. The only thing that's changed is that the nature of the recording equipment has changed, but it's still exactly the same as we did in 1991, and that's I think the way heavy metal should be made. I don't think you should be making heavy metal in a kind of sterile digital environment, So there's no grand plan.
I was wondering, since you, at least on the last album, you had like those bits more folkish, I'd say, more like not like strictly metal. You probably know what I'm referring to. That's like those more instrumental parts which sounded more like folkish music. And I was wondering if you have ever felt an urge to make a whole album based on something like on such sounds, or is it just something which fits your music but it ends there?
Again, like I said, there's no huge plan. I mean, the bits that the interesting thing is the bits that you say are folky, other people think sound like post-wave, early 80s. People have said to me, I can hear Killing Joke. I can tell you no one, that man sounds like Killing Joke. It's like, no one listens to Killing Joke except me, and I don't write the music. Now you can maybe spot a Hawkwind bass line, but so the point is that some of the last album is a bit more curious, a bit more diverse, a bit more involved, complicated. It's darker in a way, it's a bit more gloomy, it's a bit less anthemic heavy metal style, so but the bits that are like that, different people see different things in them. So what sounds maybe like a folky part to you, I've had people say, what's going on here, it sounds like I said, Killing Joke or Swans or something. It's like, really, where have you got that from? But it's, again, it doesn't bother me. I mean, a folk and acoustic album is something we've talked about because the rest of the guys maybe are more into Irish traditional music than me, but they could easily turn their hand to a very interesting, genuinely dark, Irish themed, folkloric, mythologically based traditional album. I think they could do it and do it really, really well. Simon, for example, is a great singer, like a trad singer. They can buy different instruments. It's just, again, it comes back to the first answer, to find the time within all the other life responsibilities and the mundane, kind of like murky waters we all have to fucking wade through to get to the other side of every day and pay the rent and the bills, to actually find the time to go, okay, this month I'm setting it aside to do, acoustic music or something is,
Okay, so
difficult.
yeah, okay.
By the way, this isn't product placement. I'm actually tired. I would like to be in your academy, and can you fly me around the world, please?
Okay, so I'd like to.
That's not a joke.
I'd like to move to the topic of the last album, especially one song which struck me with lyrical theme,
Okay.
as the first song, "Nail Their Tongues," is basically, from what I got, was about Lucifer.
Luther.
Luther, of course,
yeah.
Luther, confronting those who were opposing his Reformation,
Sure.
and you called them liars. And I was wondering, how did you come up with such a topic, especially being from Ireland, which is mostly Catholic place?
Well, that's an interesting question. I mean, for this, it's when you've written so many lyrics and so many albums, and they are often culturally, historically themed, trying to find a different way of expressing something similar that fits into the primordial framework. So I began to really look at, say, 15th to 17th century European foundations. So let's call it the kind of Enlightenment era. I suppose what you could say the building blocks for the modern 21st century world, which came in the sort of post-feudal, pre-industrial European society, but especially through people like Isaac Newton and that kind of thing. The birth of the Enlightenment, we're talking about the separation of science and faith and magic. I've written about alchemy and stuff like that before, but specifically about rationality, empiricism, reason. And also the character of Luther fascinates me, because it just that pinning the declaration to the church door set in motion a sequence of events that still impact our lives today, And so I was trying to write it from this the perspective of looking back through history, that single deeds of men or women that can change the course of history without them knowing, of course, at the time. So you go to the diet of worms and all this kind of stuff, and the sort of following split within the church, and then what the repercussions that had in Europe. So I became very interested in, say, like secret societies like the Rosicrucians, this kind of stuff. I suppose you could call it the foundations of modern Europe as Europe kind of moved out of the Dark Ages and stuff, which I'd never written about before. And also the other thing about it is that sometimes people take the lyrics, I won't say too seriously, but a little bit too literally. Sometimes it's poetry, to nail, the mouth of fire and all this kind of. I'm using biblical imagery to sort of try and paint a sort of very dramatic picture, similar to what we look back and see in these dramatic woodcuts and in these incredible engravings and churches and stuff like this, And so he's an interesting character, and also to keep blah blah blahing, but I'm not Catholic, so my ancestry is half of it is English and Protestant, which placed me as growing up outside of Irish society, looking in. So there was an element of that informed the lyrics, and like growing up in a very Catholic country, but in different schools and different structures. Growing up secular in a religious country, So so it's a kind of mixture of things. Sometimes you have to look for a topic that will suit the drama of heavy metal, the pathos of heavy metal, So you need something which you can imbue within it the dramatic gesture, which is really important. So those two things seem to fit perfectly. That's a sort of, post-biblical hysteria that gripped Europe in, the sort of 16th century. Blah 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 blah. Yeah.
Okay, so keeping to the topic, and also taking into the account that what you said about your perspective, it's probably common knowledge that the Catholic Church in Ireland now faces a dire situation, to be brutally honest, because of scandals and things that have been going around. If this has sort of transpired to your music, if this has some kind of influence the current situation, or is it just strictly more from the historic side, from a historic interest?
Well, I mean, look, we grew up in Ireland. We grew up in an Ireland, a poor Ireland in the 80s. We were teenagers in the 80s when the Catholic Church still had an immense influence on Irish society. And the dark horror of the post-famine 150 years of Irish society at the hands of the Catholic Church is pretty grim. It's there's no escape in that. So obviously they were a target for us when we were writing songs 25 years ago. But the kind of anti-Christian, anti-whatever thematic is done by most bands. So for me, the historical, I'd rather consider the 50 historical reasons or 500 or whatever reasons that got us to the situation, as opposed to writing just about being anti-Christian or something, because that seems to be done to death in heavy metal. It's not. They don't need an anti-Christian song necessarily from me. I have songs, of course, against other things, but that's not really what interests me. So I'm more interested in the history that brought us to this point. Like after the famine in Ireland, when literally a country on its knees essentially handed over the organisation and structure of its schools to the Catholic Church, which of course for the next 150 years basically became a very open paedophile ring. It's one thing leads to another, and what are the 100 reasons that land you in between? So I don't know. Yeah, no. Yes and no.
Okay.
So it would be easier if I just said yes and no to things,
We have one musician who likes to answer his interviews with yes or no or silence. So last question, the serious question, like the last serious question would be the cover of the Exile Amongst the Ruins. I know for a fact that this is a sculpture from Greece, and I was wondering why actually this one. Does it portray something which you wanted to communicate through the album, or is it just for most metal bands it just looks kick-ass?
For me, at least, it has symbolic identification with the lyrics. I mean, the concept is that those who see the future ruin of our civilization, those are the people who will be in exile. And so, in light of people rewriting history, this sort of modern fake history, the pulling down of statues, the attempt to completely unmoor the past, and to tell us that we have no right to how we should relate to our history or culture or mythology or folklore. I mean, I say this to people like, in a modern context, like to the people who are the unwitting foot soldiers of the modern globalist agenda. It's like, weren't you the people who were against globalism during the G8 riots? Now you're on the side of the same people who want to turn the world into one howling, desolate Walmart, the Walmartization of this world. And so the concepts of the album are about the foundations of modern Western civilization that people are attempting to collapse for their own identitarian ends or that kind of thing. The end of classical civilization, the end of also the concepts within the Enlightenment, which were empiricism, rationality, reasoned debate, so that you actually speak to those you oppose. You don't just try and shut them down or no platform them or whatever. So I'm trying to say something vaguely modern through what is an iconoclastic image of a defaced statue, because it would seem to me that there's an attempt by a modern section of society to rewrite the past. Obviously, that's not something that bodes well for the future if that's what you're attempting to do. If you're out in the streets pretending to be a revolutionary, because it's your tribe, you're another lost, angry soul poked by the algorithm of social media. Be careful what you wish for, because it very well might happen, and then it's going to be a little bit more than you bargained for. The balkanization of Western Europe.
Okay, so now let's go.
Let's go to the goofy question.
Yeah, let's goof around for a bit. First question, which is a special guest question from Alan Averill. He's asking if you're envious because he's a better vocalist.
Yeah. Well, when he starts singing in English, then we can judge these things, you know. If you stop speaking in this stupid make-up language or whatever, you know. A better vocal. Well, yeah, he is. He does have tighter pants. Maybe that is the key to becoming a better.
You heard that?
Maybe that's the key to becoming a better vocalist is tighter pants. I can't wear cowboy boots. I don't think anybody with a shaved head can pull off cowboy boots. If you're doing that and you have a shaved head, don't do it. You just look like an extra from an 80s porn movie maybe or something, you know. And the answer is yes, I am jealous.
Okay, so as we've been talking about getting on with our normal lives, also including our passions, I also have to make my living. So I've heard actually you're a vivid fan of football.
Mm-hmm.
So there is a match coming, Denmark versus Ireland,
yeah.
in 1 month. So I want to know how to bet.
Denmark. Bet Denmark. Unless Christian Eriksen's not having a great season, I would bet against Ireland. It's complicated to see if Eriksen doesn't play well or he's going to be not unavailable, then Ireland have a chance of grinding out a really dull 0-0.
Okay.
But if I were you, I would go for a 2-1 Denmark victory with a Shane Long goal in like the 80th minute or something.
Thanks for talking. It was
No
very
problem.
nice.
No worries.
Have a great concert.
Yeah, we'll try, sir. Hopefully that was all right. You got some brothers.